Is this the best camera for video? It's the Nikon Z8, the most powerful mirrorless camera on the market today. But I'm not convinced. So I want to shoot an actual project with this camera using a real crew, a real budget, and I want to see how the Nikon Z8 performs in the real world as a professional camera. I want to see what the Nikon Z8 can and cannot do, and if it's actually worth the hype. So let's shoot something absolutely epic with this camera, or at least as epic as it can be for YouTube and on my budget. All right, so we're gonna start this video off strong. I've got the Nikon Z8 shooting in glorious 8K RAW at 60 frames per second and 4K RAW at 120 frames per second with YouTube's most popular anamorphic lenses, the Blazar Remuses. So we're going to shoot a cowboy blasting through the field on a horse right behind me and see how all of it looks. Punch it, Chewy. Right off the bat, I was blown away by how good the image looked. More specifically, by how much information there was in the raw image. I was easily able to save clipped highlights and bring up shadows with ease. Because the horse was always moving, the lighting was always changing, and I could never set an exact exposure. And the dynamic range on this camera absolutely saved my butt, because this is a real commercial for a brand. I just happened to be making a YouTube video on the side, and exposure mistakes like this would normally get me fired. Officially, Nikon Z8 has 12.5 stops of dynamic range, which is about the same as the Sony FX3. And even though we're shooting RAW, we're not going to get the same dynamic range or performance as a Red camera or an ARRI Alexa. The one thing that really impressed me was how good the slow motion looked. Normally on mirrorless cameras like this, when shooting in 8K, you'll get a lot of rolling shutter, you'll get some sort of quality compromise, or the worst thing, you'll get a bunch of extra noise. But in this case, the image quality was absolutely pristine. So, that's what this camera looks like. I like the footage, but what do you guys think? I won't really know how good the 8K RAW is and how flexible it is until I get into the editing suite at the end of this video, but so far I like what I'm getting. But next up, what I really want to shoot is cars, so let's get into that. All right, so it's day 2 and we're shooting a 72 Cutlass here in the studio. This vintage car really fits the theme and vibe of the Master Supply Co. commercial, but I have a whole sequence planned around this car that we're going to be shooting here today in studio. On day 2, we put the camera on a shoulder mount with some very beefy Pavo anamorphic lenses. Normally, if this was a cinema camera, this would be a very heavy and difficult setup to work with. But in comparison, the Z8 is much smaller and easier to work with, while still giving me absolutely insane image quality. And I can even get the Z8 into very tight spaces for handheld shots with just a monitor on. For most of the day, I was operating this camera alone. I was really happy with how easy this camera is to work with for solo shooters. The design is perfect and everything is exactly where it should be. The best part about the Z8 is how small it is and how easy it is to rig up for not only shoulder mounts, but also other things like jibs and gimbals. I absolutely love what we got in the studio so far, but the next thing I'm going to show you is going to blow your mind. We have a jib on the back of this car with a gimbal, and we're actually going to take the car onto the road and shoot some car chase shots. Now, I love the car footage, but we had one major issue with the Z8 when shooting this footage, and that was the fact that the wireless control on the camera completely stopped working. It might be because the camera was wrapped up in plastic bags during this portion to protect it from the rain, but I could not change the ISO on my camera while we were on the road, so because of this, I ended up getting wildly underexposed images. And I'll be honest, I was freaking out. But the Nikon Z8 did redeem itself, because when I took the Nikon RAW into DaVinci Resolve, I was able to pretty much make it look like it was never underexposed. I was easily able to bring up the shadows and the midtones, and it honestly looked really good, and I didn't see any major loss of quality. And seeing this is where I just absolutely fell in love with this camera, and I knew it was ready for the final test. So what exactly is the hardest test for any camera? Every camera sensor can only see so much when it comes to light values and color range. And when you're working in a hot mess of environment like this, where you have RGB lights, bicolor lights, and strobes, it just becomes a hot mess to color grade, and most cameras really struggle. So I want to see how exactly does the Nikon Z8 hold up in this environment, and is the 8K RAW good enough to handle this hot mess? On day 3, the lighting was a hot mess. Exposure was all over the place with tons of hot spots, and I often had to slightly underexpose to make everything work. And when shooting with mixed lighting like this, your colors can often start to look muddy and unnatural, kind of like this intro shot here. And the Z8 did not disappoint. The colors look natural and defined, and the skin tones especially look really good. So there's one more thing I want to test out, and that's low light shooting. I haven't really seen anything be quite as good as the A7S III. We shot this entirely at 4000 ISO, which is the second native ISO. But just to make things even harder, I shot with a red LED light, which makes it even harder in low light because red light has a very short wavelength. And to my absolute surprise, the image is actually halfway decent. It's still a clean image with nice shadows, and the colors between the skin tone and the jacket are still well defined despite the red lights. All right, so it's been like a week of craziness, 3 shoot days, and then prepping for shoots in between. I'm exhausted, but I want to see exactly how good this Nikon Z8 looks. So next up, let's go into the editing studio, cut something together, and take a look at this footage in DaVinci Resolve. So it's been about a month and a half, and I do have the first cut of this commercial, which I will put at the end of this video, and if you can, please watch it, if only for my self-confidence. So in this section, let's do a deep dive not only in the editing process of this camera, but also a closer look at the specs of this camera and why they matter to certain kinds of shooters. Now, the main piece of tech that allows all of this amazing video to be shot is the 45 megapixel full frame sensor inside of the Z8. And this is why we can shoot 8K video up to 60 frames per second and 4K at 120 frames per second, again in a RAW codec that's also 12-bit. However, the Nikon Z8 actually has 2 different flavors of RAW. One is ProRes RAW and the other one is Nikon RAW. I naturally went with Nikon RAW because again, it's a Nikon camera, but also Nikon RAW is the only way to shoot 8K at 60 and 4K at 120, whereas ProRes RAW taps out at 4K 60. But one major thing to note is that Nikon RAW can only be used by DaVinci Resolve and ProRes RAW can only be used by Final Cut. So you have to know those programs if you're going to work with this camera. Sadly, I'm a Premiere Pro user. I know, crazy in 2024, who uses Premiere Pro? Honestly, it's not that much of a hassle because the camera does make in-camera proxies, so the proxy workflow, as you'll see later on, is really not that hard. So how does the Nikon RAW codec actually perform and what is it like to edit with? Now, I'm not a professional colorist, but I know enough to be dangerous, and I was shocked by how much room there was in the highlights and how much there was in the shadows. You can literally raise your exposure by 2 points and basically have no penalty when it comes to your actual image. And you can really push that color saturation to a ludicrous level without any artifacting. And if you look at the before and after, it's pretty crazy. Now, as good as the image looks, here's one problem. Because of how Nikon does their codec compression, compared to a RED camera, the Nikon files are massive, like almost too big. Each day of shooting, we got about 2 terabytes of footage, and we didn't really even shoot that much. So I basically ended up with 6 terabytes of footage at the end of the day. And for that, not only did I have to buy 2 separate Samsung T7s, but on top of that, I also had to get 2 terabyte cards to actually fit everything. And just that is going to run you about an extra $1,000 to $1,500. But when it comes to actually editing with the Nikon Z8 and completing your final project, the process is super simple. The Nikon Z8 actually shoots full HD proxies along with your RAW files, so as soon as you're done, you actually have proxy files ready to go without needing to worry about data transfers or transcoding RAW footage. But if you have the money for an SSD and enough drive space, you can easily do a completely raw workflow in DaVinci Resolve because surprisingly enough, these RAW files aren't clunky the way I expected them to be. They're about as nimble and easy to work with as RED RAW files. But does this camera still make sense for video shooters that maybe don't need 8K RAW and maybe you just don't have the hard drive space or the data budget? Well, there are a few options for you. You can also shoot 4K RAW up to 60 frames per second, which will save you significant amount of data. And in 4K at 24 frames per second, the RAW format is actually downsampled from 8K, so you still get the same 8K detail, but in a smaller 4K file. However, there is one issue with this. In this mode, there's actually a color shift and a small clip on your black levels, so it's really not the most ideal format to shoot in. However, if you just want to save data, it is a format that's available. But 4K 30 and 4K 60 in RAW look perfectly fine, but they're not downsampled. And if you don't want RAW at all, Nikon does have one feature that I think a lot of videographers will appreciate, and that is the inclusion of ProRes HQ at 422 color that is also in 10 bits. And in this mode, you can shoot 4K up to 60 frames per second and Full HD up to 120 frames per second. There is a very tiny crop on this image, but I promise you will not even notice it. It's like 1.12. But if you want a happy medium between the two, there's also H.265 and H.264. H.265 will let you shoot 8K up to 30 frames per second and 4K up to 120 frames per second. But two problems with this mode is that one, there's a lot of noise reduction, so it's not really something you want to use for cinematic stuff where there's going to be a lot of pixel peeping. And while it is a 10-bit codec, it's only in 420 color, so it's really not the best for color grading. This codec is best for corporate work where you're just shooting something, editing it together, and it's out the door. But there is one thing about this camera that might be an absolute deal breaker for some shooters, and some of you guys may actually be wondering when I was gonna bring this up, and that is the autofocus. Most YouTubers will tell you, oh my God, the autofocus is amazing, it's as good as Sony. They're wrong or lying. Most YouTubers do this really crappy test where they walk back and forth in front of the camera, and the autofocus does a pretty decent job. I'm guilty of doing it myself. But when you actually push the autofocus on this camera, where the camera starts to move and the subject starts to move in weird ways, the autofocus does not keep up. But here's the thing, I don't think it matters. On the very high end, people that are shooting 8K RAW at 60 frames per second, such as this commercial, you're gonna be shooting on cinema lenses, you're gonna be shooting on anamorphic lenses, and you're going to hire a focus puller. So with that being said, the question that I asked at the very start of this video, is this the best camera for video? Is it good enough for professional work? And after having shot an actual professional commercial with it, I can safely say this is one of the best video cameras, but also one of the best deals for video cameras if you have the budget for hard drive space. The main drawback of the Nikon Z8 is not the autofocus, but it's how big these RAW files are, and they're a lot bigger than something like the Red Komodo. Nikon is absolutely killing it with video cameras right now. And without further ado, check out the links in the description, and here is the commercial. Peace.